In the world of action cinema, where strength is often just an illusion crafted by special effects, Michael Jai White steps forward as one of the rare true embodiments of real power. He is not just an actor, but a high-level martial artist with a diverse background, holding black belts in multiple disciplines such as Kyokushin karate, taekwondo, Brazilian jiu-jitsu, and many others. This makes every punch and every action sequence he performs on screen carry an authenticity that very few Hollywood stars can achieve. In 1997, he made history as the first black actor to play a superhero in the film Spawn, opening an important door for diversity in American cinema. Although the movie did not achieve massive commercial success, that role remains an iconic milestone. After that, he continued to solidify his status with a series of memorable performances, especially as the character Boyka in Undisputed 2, a role that turned his name into a legend in modern martial arts films. Beyond acting, he also writes scripts, produces, and directs, showcasing a rare level of versatility. Throughout his career, Michael Jai White has not only built the image of an action star, but has also become a symbol of discipline, dedication, and authenticity. A man who turned his body into the perfect tool to tell stories through action rather than words. But behind all those achievements lies a story that the spotlight never reaches. The story of a father who had to face an irreparable loss. When he lost his child, every concept of strength he once believed in seemed to collapse in silence. No technique was fast enough to save a fate already sealed. No punch was strong enough to defeat the pain eating away from within. The long nights grew heavier as his mind was haunted by unanswerable questions. What if I had done things differently? But instead of completely breaking down, Michael Jai White chose to keep getting back up. Not because he felt no pain, but because he refused to let the pain define who he was. He kept training, kept working, kept living, as a way to keep himself from being swallowed by memory. His will was no longer about winning, it became about surviving. And in that very silence, he proved that true strength does not lie in the ability to knock down opponents, but in continuing to walk forward, even when the heart has shattered. If Michael Jai White's story makes you think about the real strength of a human being, please hit subscribe so you don't miss this haunting journey. Michael Jai White's childhood did not begin with dreams, but with vigilance. He was born in Brooklyn, New York, a place where the pace of life doesn't allow children to stay weak for long. But even Brooklyn was just the starting point. When he was very young, he moved to Bridgeport, Connecticut, a city where many neighborhoods carried the scars of poverty, crime, and violence. There, childhood was not something to enjoy, but something to survive day by day. No one stood beside him to teach him how to dream. No one guaranteed that tomorrow would be safer than today. The streets where he grew up didn't care who you were, how old you were, or whether you were afraid. They only cared whether you were strong enough to survive. From a very young age, Michael learned a lesson no child should have to learn. Never let your guard down. He learned to observe everything around him, the look in a stranger's eyes, the sound of footsteps behind him, the smallest signs of approaching danger. While other kids were still playing carefree, he had to learn to read situations, anticipate risks, and always prepare for the worst. Innocence was replaced by survival instinct, trust was replaced by suspicion, and the feeling of safety was almost non-existent. Not because he didn't want to believe in the world, but because the world around him never gave him a reason to. There was no normal childhood in the sense most people understand. No carefree afternoons, no vacations filled with laughter, no feeling of absolute protection in someone's arms. What he had was a reality that forced him to grow up too soon. Every passing day felt like a test where mistakes couldn't be easily fixed. He didn't have many choices. Either adapt or be swallowed. And he chose to adapt, not because he was stronger than other kids, but because he had no other option. That environment deeply etched into his mind a view of the world, a world that is unfair, unkind, and waits for no one, each small experience accumulated, shaping a person always in a state of readiness to fight. Not because he wanted to become a warrior, but because he was forced to become one to survive. Other children could learn to trust first, and then learn to defend. Michael was the opposite. He learned to defend first, and almost never had the chance to fully learn how to trust. And deep down, a quiet truth took shape. A belief he never voiced, but always carried like a shadow. No one was coming to save him. No miracles. No heroes. No hand would appear at the right moment to pull him out of danger. No one was coming to save him. That wasn't a fleeting thought. It was a life principle. It made him stronger but also lonelier, because when you believe you have to save yourself, you also learn not to rely on anyone else. It was in that uncaring world that a boy began to form his survival instincts, not by choice, but by the force of circumstance. And perhaps the most painful part wasn't that he had to grow up in such a harsh environment, but that he got used to it, used to the lack of safety, used to always being on guard, used to the feeling that life owed him nothing. Those things didn't just shape Michael Jai White's childhood. They became the foundation for the man he later became, a man who could stand firm against every punch life threw, but who also learned to endure in silence from far too young an age. It was in a world where everything could turn dangerous at any moment that Michael Jai White found something that at first wasn't a dream, but simply a way not to get hurt. Martial arts. He began training at a very young age, not because he wanted to become a champion, not because he was drawn to glory, but because he understood one very clear thing. If he didn't know how to protect himself, he would become a victim. In an environment where violence was not rare, martial arts was no longer a choice but a survival necessity. The punches, the locks, the movements were not performance techniques but tools to stay safe in an unkind world. At first, it was just reflex, a way to fight fear, but over time, what started as instinct gradually became a system, a structure, something that gave him a sense of control he had never had before. When he stepped into the dojo, everything changed. Outside was chaos, uncertainty, danger always lurking. But in that space, everything had rules. There was discipline. There was order. Every movement had purpose. Every drill had meaning. And for the first time in his life, Michael didn't have to anticipate danger. He learned to face it with control. The dojo became the only place where he could breathe normally. There, no one cared where he came from. No one judged him by his past, and no one tried to hurt him. The only thing that mattered was effort, persistence, the ability to push past his own limits. In a world where he always had to stay vigilant, this place gave him a rare feeling. The feeling that if he did it right, if he trained hard enough, the results would come. No unfairness, no randomness, just cause and effect. And gradually, martial arts was no longer just a way to defend himself. It became the way he understood the world. Each punch taught him precision. Each fall taught him to get back up. Each drill taught him that strength doesn't come from luck, but from discipline repeated thousands of times. While life outside remained chaotic, he began building an inner order within himself, an order no one could take away. But that came at a cost. When you learn to fight before you learn to live, you start seeing everything as a fight. You don't trust easily. You always prepare for the worst. You always keep distance. And over time, that doesn't just protect you, it also isolates you. Michael was no longer the scared boy he once was, but he also wasn't a carefree child. He became someone always ready, always vigilant, always in control. A strong person, but not an approachable one. Martial arts gave him strength, but it also shaped how he saw himself. Strength was no longer a choice. It became a condition for survival. If he was weak, he would get hurt. If he was slow, he would be overtaken. If he let his guard down, he would pay the price. And so he didn't allow himself to be weak, didn't allow himself to lose control, didn't allow himself to fall. Those principles helped him survive, but they also made him carry an invisible pressure throughout his life. Some people turned to martial arts to discover themselves. Michael turned to martial arts to protect himself from a world that had been too harsh to him. But in the process, he unintentionally found his true self. Not a warrior who loved violence, but someone seeking order amid chaos, seeking meaning in a life full of uncertainty. Martial arts didn't turn him into someone else. It helped him become a stronger version of himself, a version that could endure, could control, could keep moving forward. And if his childhood taught him that the world didn't care about him, then martial arts taught him that he could still control how he faced that world. It didn't make life any easier. It didn't erase the dangers. But it gave him something more valuable, the ability not to be broken by them. Violence shaped him. Discipline saved him. Violence shaped who he was, but discipline saved him from becoming part of that chaos. And from there, an identity began to form. Not a boy just trying to survive, but a man learning to exist on his own terms, through strength, through discipline, and through a will that wasn't easily broken. After all those years of training, when his body had become powerful and his mind had been disciplined to the point of being nearly unbreakable, Michael Jai White entered a phase that many would call stable. He became a teacher, a respectable job, with income, structure, and meaning in the way society still defines it. Every day he stood in front of the class, sharing knowledge, guiding students, and fulfilling the responsibilities expected of an adult. From the outside, it was the kind of life many people dream of. No more chaos from childhood. No more dangers lurking around every corner. No more feeling like he had to fight just to survive. Everything seemed settled. But it was precisely in that stability that a void began to form. Quietly, slowly, but impossible to ignore. He no longer had to fight every day just to stay alive. But because of that, he started to realize he wasn't really living. The days blended together until they were hard to tell apart. Mornings at class, afternoons wrapping up work, evenings repeating familiar routines. No danger, but also no sense of moving forward. No fear, but also no clear purpose. A safe life, but one missing meaning. And for someone who had grown used to fighting to survive, safety sometimes became a kind of emptiness that was hard to describe. Inside him, a question began to echo, growing clearer over time. Is this all there is? He had done everything right. He had avoided the dangerous paths. He had built a stable life. But why did it still feel like he was standing still? As if he had escaped the past, but had never truly stepped into the future. Those hours standing at the front of the classroom, looking into the students' eyes, sometimes he wondered if they saw something he himself didn't recognize. A man fulfilling his duties, but not truly living with a purpose. That contradiction gradually became clearer. On one side was responsibility, the stable job, the role in society, the things he should do. On the other side was desire, a vague feeling that he could be something more, that this life wasn't meant to stop at safe survival. But that desire had no specific shape. It wasn't a clear dream, not a goal he could name. It was just a feeling that something was missing, and that very thing made him feel more lost than ever. The irony was that throughout his childhood, he never had time to feel lost. When you're trying to survive, you don't have the luxury of thinking about meaning. You just do what's necessary to keep going. But when the threats disappear, when life becomes stable, the void starts to appear, and Michael began facing a different kind of hardship. Not danger from the outside, but emptiness from within. He still trained, still kept his discipline, still held on to the principles that had saved him from the past. But now, those things weren't enough to fill the void. Martial arts had once been the answer to fear, but now, with fear no longer clear, that answer became vague. He was no longer fighting to protect himself, but he also didn't know what he was fighting for. There were evenings when everything was quiet, when the noise of work or the busyness of the day faded, that the feeling became clearest. A silence that wasn't peace, but emptiness. A feeling that he was passing through life, but leaving no mark. Not because he lacked ability, but because he hadn't found direction yet. And for someone used to controlling everything, that became another form of powerlessness. He was surviving, but not becoming anything. He was no longer the boy who had to fight to survive, but he also hadn't yet become the man he could be proud of. He existed between two states, no longer pulled back by the past, but not yet guided by the future. And it was in that empty space that a decision began to form, even if at first it was just a very small thought. If this life didn't have a ready path, maybe he would have to create one for himself. That thought started as just a small spark in the darkness, a vague sense that Michael Jai White's life could be more than endless classes and repeating days. He didn't grow up dreaming of becoming an actor. Hollywood had never been a preset destination in his mind, but there was one thing he always carried from those earlier years. If a door doesn't exist, you have to find a way to open it yourself. And then, step by step, he began stepping into the world of acting. Not with the confidence of someone who knew he would succeed, but with the discipline of someone used to starting from zero. At first, it was just small roles, brief appearances, opportunities that many others might see as insignificant. But for Michael, every role was a fight. He learned to control his body in front of the camera, learned to convey emotion, learned to survive in a world completely different from the dojo, where not just strength, but subtlety and inner depth were what mattered. He didn't have an advantageous starting point, no connections, no one backing him up. But he had something Hollywood rarely sees: authenticity. When he hit, he really hit. When he moved, it wasn't acting, it was reflexes honed over decades. Then, the big opportunity came. In 1997, he was cast in the lead role in Spawn, a historic milestone as he became one of the first black actors to play a superhero in modern cinema. It wasn't just a role, it was a symbol, a step forward for diversity, a door that seemed like it would open everything he had ever searched for. For the first time, the world started paying attention to him. For the first time, the name Michael Jai White was placed center stage. No longer a supporting character, no longer a shadow behind anyone else. And in that moment, it was easy to believe this was the turning point. That all those years of discipline, all the quiet efforts, all the invisible battles he had endured, were finally being rewarded. That from here, the path would become clear. That he would join the ranks of big stars. That life would finally start turning the way he had waited for so long. But reality didn't play out that way. Spawn didn't become the explosive hit everyone expected. The film had meaning, had impact, but it wasn't strong enough to launch him to the top of Hollywood. The door had opened, but only partway. After the premiere lights faded, after the initial praise, things gradually went back to how they were. The big roles didn't automatically come. The opportunities he thought would appear didn't arrive. And once again, he found himself in a familiar place, close to what he wanted, but never quite touching it. It was a feeling hard to describe. Not complete failure, but also not full success. Like standing in front of a door that had cracked open, enough to see what was inside, but not enough to step through. And in some ways, that hurt more than if the door had never opened at all. Because once you glimpsed what you could become, not achieving it becomes so much harder to accept. Michael didn't give up. He kept working, kept taking other roles, kept training. But now, he understood that Hollywood didn't operate on the logic of the dojo. There, effort doesn't always lead to results. Talent isn't always recognized, and fairness isn't a required rule. He wasn't lacking skill. He wasn't lacking discipline. But there were things beyond his control. Timing, trends, the choices of those in power. And that created a small crack in the belief he had built his entire life around. In the dojo, if you trained hard enough, you improved. If you were disciplined enough, you got stronger. But in Hollywood, you could do everything right and still get nowhere. A new lesson, and one that was far from easy to accept. The door opened, but never fully. That phrase didn't just describe a moment, it described an entire phase of his life. A phase where he had crossed the threshold of opportunity, but was held back just before reaching the peak. And what made it heavier wasn't that he didn't succeed right away, but that he had to learn to keep moving forward, knowing this path would never be as smooth as he had once hoped. After the moment that many believed would change everything, Michael Jai White didn't step onto a straight path to the top, but entered an even more confusing phase. A phase where he proved he was good enough, but still wasn't chosen. What makes his story special isn't that he lacked talent, but that he possessed far too many of the things Hollywood claims it needs, yet didn't receive the corresponding opportunities. He wasn't an actor who had to learn how to pretend to fight. He was a real warrior. Every punch, every kick, every movement came from decades of training, from sessions repeated so many times that his body reacted before his mind could even form the thought. His physique wasn't built in a gym to look good on camera. It was built to endure, to fight, to survive. And that should have been his greatest advantage in an industry that celebrates action. But the paradox started right there. He was far better than many in his field, better in the real sense, not in the way Hollywood often promotes. Yet the hard truth was, being good didn't mean being chosen. People with more limited skills got bigger roles. Faces with less experience became the center of projects he could only watch from the sidelines. And over time, a question began to form. Not in anger, but in silence. What am I still missing? Hollywood isn't a dojo. It doesn't run on the rule that the harder you work, the more you win. It runs on image, on marketability, on factors a person like Michael couldn't control. Appearance, commercial appeal, trends, even luck. All of them played bigger roles than pure ability. And in that system, he became a living paradox, too real to be fake, yet not fitting enough to be the top choice. He couldn't pretend to be weaker to match a mold, but he also wasn't given the chance to fully showcase his real strength. The roles kept coming, but not the ones that could change his position. He appeared in many films, delivering superior skills and rare authenticity, but he was never placed under the center spotlight. He became someone the industry respected, but the general audience never really knew. Someone everyone acknowledged as great, but no one turned into a major star. And that was another kind of loneliness. Not complete rejection, but being kept at just enough distance to never reach the peak. The feeling of being overlooked didn't come suddenly. It came slowly, accumulating through every role, every missed opportunity. Every time he watched someone else step into a position, he knew he could do better. No one outright said he wasn't good enough. On the contrary, many even admitted he was superior. But that acknowledgement never came with opportunity, and over time, that silence grew heavier than any outright rejection. The hardest part wasn't not being chosen, it was not understanding why. If he lacked skill, he could train more. If he lacked discipline, he could fix it. But when everything he had was already at its highest level, yet the door stayed only cracked open, then it was no longer within his control. And for someone who had spent his whole life mastering self-control, facing things he couldn't control became a greater mental challenge than any fight. Even so, he didn't stop, not because he believed everything would change right away, but because he didn't know any other way than to keep moving forward. Discipline had become part of who he was. He kept training, kept taking roles, kept working, not to prove anything to others, but to not betray himself. The world might not see his full value, but he wouldn't allow himself to forget it. He wasn't lacking talent, he was lacking opportunity. That line wasn't an excuse. It was a cold truth. Michael Jai White lacked nothing to become a major star, except the one thing he couldn't create himself: the right opportunity at the right time, in the right place, in the right way. And it was in that gap that he kept walking, not as someone lifted by the system, but as someone who had to hold his own ground, step by step, in a world where talent isn't always seen. The following years didn't bring any sudden turning point for Michael Jai White. They just extended a familiar state, the state of someone always standing very close to the top, but never quite touching it. He didn't become an A-list name. Not because he lacked ability, not because he didn't try hard enough, but because the path to that position always seemed to close right before he could step in. In an industry where fame can explode from just one role, he became an exception, someone whose career had plenty of highlights, but lacked that decisive breakout moment. Opportunities still came, but they came and went like passing winds he couldn't hold on to. A good role, a promising film, a project that could shift his position, they all appeared, then vanished before creating lasting impact. Each time, he had to start over, as if everything he'd done before wasn't enough to move him further. There was no big collapse, no devastating failure, just a long chain of incomplete opportunities, advances too short to change the trajectory of his life. And then the comparison started to appear, not from the outside, but from within him. He saw others, people without his martial arts foundation, without his level of discipline, without his authenticity. Yet they reached the positions he'd pursued for years. They became stars. They got the big roles. They appeared on posters where he could have stood. And that didn't create simple jealousy. It created something harder to name, a deep confusion about how the world works. He wasn't angry, at least not in an obvious way, because throughout his life he'd learned to control his emotions. He understood that anger doesn't change reality, but that calm didn't mean he didn't feel the heaviness building inside. There were moments when he looked back at his journey that he couldn't help but wonder, if everything I've done still isn't enough, then what else is there? What made everything harder was that he couldn't point to one specific reason. If he'd been rejected outright, if someone had said straight up that he didn't fit, he could have accepted it and moved on. But this wasn't a story of rejection. This was a story of being overlooked. No explanation, no confrontation. Just doors that didn't open, opportunities that didn't return, and a feeling that he was always on the outside, looking into a world he should have belonged to. Over time, he learned to accept it. But that acceptance didn't bring comfort. It wasn't peace. It was a kind of compromise with reality. He kept working, kept appearing, kept contributing, but he no longer expected everything to change suddenly. He didn't abandon his dream, but he also no longer placed complete faith in it the way he once did. A part of him learned to live without recognition, because he understood that if he waited for it, he might wait forever. And it was in that state that one truth became clearer than ever. He wasn't someone rejected once. He was someone overlooked again and again throughout the entire journey. He wasn't rejected once. He was overlooked forever. That statement wasn't a complaint. It was an accurate description of the reality he had lived. There was no single massive collapse, but a prolonged process where every passing day reminded him that the world isn't always fair, and talent isn't always seen. But what makes Michael Jai White's story different isn't that he was overlooked. It's how he responded to it. He didn't stop. He didn't turn away. He didn't become bitter. He kept moving forward, not because he believed the world would change, but because he refused to let the world define his worth. And in a world that had looked away from him so many times, he still stood there, not as a celebrated star, but as a man who had learned to exist without the recognition he deserved. After all those years of being overlooked in silence, when the name Michael Jai White gradually started getting more opportunities on the big screen, that should have been the moment of liberation, the moment he finally stepped out from the shadow of being forgotten. But the paradox of Hollywood is that sometimes the door that opens doesn't lead to freedom. It leads to another kind of captivity. Roles started getting bigger in scale, larger projects began coming his way, and among them, high-profile commercial films like Casino Royale or international action projects helped him appear in front of wider audiences, not as the center, but enough to be seen, enough to be acknowledged in the way Hollywood allows. Then the villain roles became his safe zone. With his rugged build, cold gaze, and absolute control, he became the perfect choice for dangerous, quiet, and deeply threatening characters. Roles like Hannibal, not literally, but in the archetype of a strong, cold, almost emotionless figure, began shaping how audiences perceived him. He did them well. In fact, he did them too well. Every appearance brought such raw authenticity that viewers believed it wasn't acting, and that very thing became a double-edged sword. At first, it was opportunity, a type of role he could completely master, a way to assert himself in an industry that doesn't easily accept people like him. But over time, those roles stopped being choices and became a mold. He was no longer asked what he wanted to play. He was given roles others thought he fit. And gradually, the gap between his real self and his on-screen image began to widen. Fame increased, but freedom decreased. Every successful role in the cold, strong, killer archetype tied him tighter to that very image. Audiences started expecting him to be that way. Producers started believing he should only be that way. And Hollywood, as it always operates, doesn't encourage change when a formula works. That meant the more successful you are with one image, the harder it is to escape it. For Michael, it was another kind of deadlock. More subtle, harder to notice, but no less heavy. He was no longer forgotten like before. But now, he was trapped in a version of himself he didn't fully control. The roles brought attention, but they also took away the chance to show other sides of himself. A man with depth, with thoughts, with emotions, reduced to a simple image. Strong, cold, dangerous, and the most painful part was, he understood it, but couldn't easily change it. Because in Hollywood, image isn't just how you're seen. It's what decides whether you keep working or not. If he turned down those roles, he might lose opportunities. If he accepted them, he stayed boxed in. A choice where both sides carried their own price. There were times when he looked at the screen and saw a version of himself he didn't fully recognize. Not because he acted wrong, but because he was limited to what others wanted to see. And in quiet moments, when the lights were off and the cameras were gone, the question returned, not about his career, but about himself. Who am I really, when these roles aren't there? The more famous he became, the less he was himself. That wasn't a complaint. It was a slow realization formed through every role, every decision, every opportunity shaped by others. Michael Jai White had entered Hollywood to find a path of his own, but over time he realized that path wasn't entirely his. Fame brought him the recognition he once lacked, but it also came with a price. The price of having to exist within an image he didn't fully choose, and in a world where everyone saw him, a paradoxical truth existed. The more he was seen, the less he was understood. But everything Michael Jai White had gone through, the deprivation, the years living in vigilance, the times being overlooked, the invisible molds of Hollywood, none of it prepared him for what was coming next. Because there are battles in life where no skill is enough to win, No discipline is enough to control, and no strength is enough to change the outcome. And that was the day he lost his son. There was no warning, no moment long enough to brace himself. The tragedy didn't arrive like a noisy storm, but like a small crack in reality. A piece of news, a phone call, a moment where everything before and after seemed completely severed. At first came disbelief, a natural reflex of the mind facing the unacceptable. He wasn't someone who panicked easily. He had been trained to stay calm in every situation, but this time, that calm wasn't control. It was paralysis. In those first moments, he didn't cry. He didn't scream. He didn't react the way people imagine grief. He just stood there, as if his body had forgotten how to respond, as if all those years of training, all the reflexes that once saved him from danger, were now useless. Because this wasn't a situation he could react to. This was an irreversible truth. Then the truth began to sink in, not in one moment, but in every passing second, as he was forced to realize this was real. No punch could fix it. No tactic could change it. No next time to redo it. The hope he had tried to build for his son, the hope he believed he could control through protection and guidance, began to crack. And when it shattered, it didn't shatter loudly. It shattered in silence, but hard enough to destroy everything inside him. The feeling of losing control was something Michael rarely experienced in life. He was always the one in charge of the situation. Always the one prepared. Always the one reacting faster, stronger, more precisely. But this time, he had no role to play, no action to take, just one reality: he could do nothing. And that very powerlessness became the hardest blow he had ever taken. The questions started appearing, not to find answers, but as an unstoppable loop. If only I had been there. If only I had done things differently. If only I could have prevented this. Questions with no answers, yet refusing to disappear. They repeated, day after day, night after night, like an echo in his mind he couldn't turn off. The pain didn't come in an obvious way. It wasn't always explosive emotions. Sometimes it was silence. It was moments when he sat alone, saying nothing, doing nothing, just existing with a void that had never been there before. A void no achievement could fill, no fame could lighten, no discipline could control. And in that moment, a brutal truth became clearer than ever. All the strength he had built his entire life meant nothing in this situation. He could defeat any opponent on screen. He could endure the harshest training. He could push past physical limits others wouldn't dare touch. But he couldn't do the one thing he wanted most: protect his child. That was the breaking point. Not an external collapse, but an internal shift. From that moment, strength no longer defined him the way it once did. It didn't disappear, but it lost its original meaning. Because when you've faced a pain you can't defeat, the idea of winning changes. It stops being about overcoming opponents and becomes about surviving day by day. He could fight the world, but not fate. That statement wasn't a metaphor. It was the truth. Michael Jai White had spent his entire life learning how to fight. Against people, against circumstances, against himself. But fate isn't an opponent you can face head-on. It doesn't follow rules. It isn't fair, and it doesn't care how much you've prepared. After that day, everything didn't stop. Life kept going. Work still existed. The world kept operating as if nothing had happened. But for him, everything had changed permanently. Not in a way outsiders could easily notice. No public breakdown. No obvious signs. Just a quiet but profound shift. A part of him was no longer the same. And perhaps the most painful thing wasn't the moment of loss itself, but having to keep living afterward. Having to wake up every day knowing there was something he couldn't fix. Having to keep moving forward while carrying a pain no one could fully share. a man who once believed discipline could control life, now had to learn how to live in a reality where nothing could be controlled. That wasn't a loss in the usual sense. There was no winner, no clear ending, just a truth he had to accept, whether he wanted to or not. Some battles can't be won, and sometimes the greatest strength isn't defeating an opponent, it's continuing to exist after losing the most important thing. After the day everything collapsed, Michael Jai White's life didn't stop, but it also didn't run the way it used to. There was no clear line between before and after, just a lingering sense that everything had changed forever, and in the void left by the loss, something else began to grow. Not loud, not violent, but persistent and impossible to escape. Guilt. It didn't appear all at once like a huge wave. It came slower, creeping through every thought, every silent moment, every sleepless night. At first, it was just a fleeting question. What if? But then that question didn't go away. It came back, repeated, turned into an endless loop. If only I had done things differently. If only I had been there. If only I had noticed sooner. Assumptions that couldn't be proven, yet carried the weight of truth. And what made them more painful was, there was no way to answer them. Michael had spent his whole life believing that if he prepared enough, if he controlled enough, if he was disciplined enough, he could avoid mistakes. But now he had to face a possibility he had never accepted, that maybe some things are beyond all preparation. And instead of freeing him, that realization made him question himself even more. Not because he was truly at fault, but because he couldn't stop searching for a reason, a foothold, a place to put that pain. The questions shifted from "what if" to "was it enough? Had I done enough? Had I been a good enough father? Had I protected enough?" The questions no longer pointed outward. They turned inward, and each time he had to face himself, not as a fighter, not as an actor, not as a strong man, but as a human trying to understand the loss with no explanation. That pain wasn't spoken about much, not because it didn't exist, but because he wasn't used to sharing. Throughout his life, he had learned to keep everything inside. Strength, for him, always came with control. And control, for many years, meant silence. He didn't seek attention. He didn't turn the pain into something for others to see. He kept working, kept appearing, kept holding the image the world was familiar with. But inside, there was a conversation that never stopped. Nights became the hardest time, when everything around him was quiet, when there was no work to distract, no noise to fill the emptiness. The thoughts became clearer. He lay there, unable to sleep, staring at the ceiling, and the questions returned. Not once, but hundreds of times, repeating like a film he couldn't turn off. His body was exhausted, but his mind wouldn't let him rest. And over time, the lack of sleep didn't just affect his body, it made every emotion heavier. There were days he still trained like before, still kept his discipline, still followed the habits that had shaped him. But even in those familiar movements, something had changed. Martial arts had once been where he found clarity. Now it became where he tried to keep himself from being swept away by thoughts. Not to fight others, but to keep himself from completely falling apart. The silence became louder than any scream. The silence he chose wasn't peace. It was another kind of sound. A sound without noise, but echoing in every thought. No one heard it, but he couldn't stop hearing it. And what made it heavier was, he still kept living, still kept working, still kept appearing as if everything was fine. There was no moment when the pain disappeared. No day when he woke up and felt completely relieved. There were better days, more bearable moments, but they didn't erase what happened. They only made carrying it a little easier. And perhaps that was the only thing he could do. Not eliminate the pain, but learn to exist with it. Guilt isn't always rational, but it doesn't need to be rational to exist. It just needs a void to cling to. And in the void left by the loss, it found its place. Michael Jai White might never find answers to those questions, but he still had to keep living with them, and in a world where people only saw his strength. There was a truth few noticed. His hardest battle wasn't on camera, it was in silence. Every day, every night, inside his own mind. But even in the longest days, when the silence grew so heavy it was almost impossible to breathe, Michael Jai White's life still didn't completely stop, not because the pain had vanished, but because time, in its cruel way, kept moving forward. And in that flow, small things began to appear. Not big enough to change everything right away, but enough to create a different direction. One of those things was the arrival of Gillian White. Their meeting wasn't a dramatic movie moment. No swelling music, no instant destiny feeling from the first glance. It happened normally, almost quietly, the way the most important things in life sometimes do. But that very normalness became different, because at that point, Michael wasn't looking for something grand. He wasn't looking for salvation. He wasn't looking for someone to fix him. He was just trying to keep surviving day by day. And perhaps that's why this relationship developed differently. Not based on perfection, not based on illusion. Gillian didn't enter his life to replace what was lost. That was impossible. She entered as someone who accepted him as he was then. A man strong on the outside but carrying cracks inside that not everyone could see. And most importantly, she didn't try to erase those cracks. Their love wasn't something that burned fiercely. It wasn't an escape from pain. It was a slow process where two people learned to exist beside each other with everything they carried. There were good days. There were hard days. There were moments when the past returned unannounced, bringing emotions Michael couldn't fully control. And in those moments, Gillian didn't demand he be okay. She didn't demand he forget. She just stayed there. For someone used to handling everything alone, that wasn't easy to accept. Michael wasn't someone who opened up easily, not because he didn't want to, but because he was used to keeping everything inside. Control had become part of his identity, but mature love doesn't require you to be perfect. It only requires you to be real. And gradually, little by little, he began allowing himself to share more. Not everything, but enough to no longer be completely isolated. Rebuilding a life didn't happen in one day. There was no breakthrough moment where everything suddenly got better. It was a series of small steps, decisions to keep going, choices not to give up, moments when he chose to stay instead of withdraw. There were days he felt he was moving forward. There were days he felt he was back at the starting point. But the important thing was, he didn't stop. Healing didn't mean forgetting. Healing didn't mean forgetting. It didn't erase the past. It didn't make the pain disappear. It only changed the way you carry it. Before, the pain was something that weighed him down, making him almost unable to move. Now, it's still there, but he learned to live with it, not by defeating it, but by not letting it control his entire life. There are mornings when he wakes up feeling a little lighter, not because everything is okay, but because he knows he doesn't have to face it all alone. There are evenings when the thoughts start returning, but he no longer gets completely swept away by them like before. Not because they disappear, but because he has an anchor, a person, a relationship, a part of life built from more than just pain. Michael didn't become a completely different person. He is still the disciplined, strong, controlled man. But now, there's something added. A softness he didn't allow himself before. Not weakness, but the ability to accept that he doesn't have to be strong all the time. And perhaps that's the most important step in this journey. Not overcoming the pain, but learning to live with it without letting it define his entire being. Love didn't heal him the way movies often portray. It didn't save him, but it gave him a reason to keep going. Not because he had to, but because he wanted to. Michael Jai White's life didn't go back to the way it was, and it didn't become a perfect story either. But in that imperfection, he found something he never had before, a way to keep living without pretending everything was fine. And sometimes, that simply continuing, day by day with everything you carry, is the strongest form of survival. After learning to keep living, step by step, Michael Jai White didn't turn his back on his career. He still returned to the set, still took roles, still stepped into scenes with the professionalism that had followed him for years. To many people, that was a sign of comeback, a man overcoming tragedy, continuing to pursue his passion, continuing to build success. And to some extent, that was true. He kept working, still appeared in action film projects, still maintained his form in roles that demanded high physicality and skill. His career didn't collapse. It continued, steady, enduring, not flashy, but also not vanishing. But something had changed that not everyone noticed. Before, every role carried a bigger meaning. Every opportunity was a step forward. Every success, no matter how small, was proof he was getting closer to what he once sought. But now, that feeling wasn't intact anymore. The roles still came. The projects still got completed. The praise still appeared. But they no longer brought the same sense of fulfillment as before. Not because he no longer loved his work, not because he lost his passion, but because something else had changed the way he viewed everything. When you've gone through a loss, nothing can replace. Every achievement starts to carry a different weight. They don't lose value, but they no longer suffice to fill the void you carry. There are moments, standing on set, finishing a tough scene, receiving recognition from colleagues, when he still feels proud. But, right after, another feeling emerges. Not overt sadness, but a hard-to-name emptiness. As if part of the joy is no longer there. As if everything is right, but no longer enough. He keeps working, not because he thinks success will heal him, but because it's part of who he is. Discipline, responsibility, dedication. Those don't vanish just because life changes. But now, work is no longer where he seeks meaning. It becomes a part of life, not its center. Some people use success to forget pain. Michael didn't do that. He didn't escape into work. He didn't try to fill the void with achievements. He understood that no role, no film, no fame could replace what he lost. And that very realization made everything clearer, but also heavier. Success felt smaller after loss. Success no longer carried the same meaning as before. It was no longer the destination. It no longer the destination. It became a part, important, but not everything. And in a world where success is often placed above all else, that made him an exception. The void is still there, not always obvious, not always dominating his thoughts, but always present. Some days it's lighter, some days it weighs heavier, but no day does it disappear completely, and he no longer tries to erase it. He just learns to live with it, as part of who he is. What makes his story different isn't that he continued to succeed after tragedy. It's that he didn't let success become a replacement for what he lost. He didn't try to prove anything to the world. He didn't try to turn the pain into a triumph story. He just kept going, working, living, and existing, with everything he carried. And perhaps that's another form of maturity. Not achieving more, but understanding that some things can't be replaced. Not filling the void, but accepting it will always be there. And in that acceptance, he found a way to keep moving forward. Not as someone chasing success, but as someone living with the full truth of his life. After everything that happened, time didn't stop. And for Michael Jai White, that became another opponent he couldn't avoid. Unlike the battles before, where he could prepare, train, find tactics to cope, time didn't give him that chance. It came slowly, almost unnoticeable day by day, but clear when looking back. The body no longer reacted as fast, the movements no longer as fluid, and the marks of the years began to show, no matter how hard he tried to maintain. For someone who had spent his whole life controlling his body, that change wasn't just physical. It was an identity challenge, because strength wasn't just something he possessed. It was part of who he was. It was how he understood the world, how he existed in it. And when the body started slowing down, the question wasn't, what else can I do? But who am I if I'm not like before? But instead of fighting that truth with denial, Michael chose another way. He continued, still maintained discipline. Still woke up every day and trained, not because he needed to prove anything to anyone, but because it was the only way he knew to keep himself from getting lost. The training sessions were no longer aimed at becoming stronger than others, no longer about reaching new peaks. They became a ritual, a way to stay connected to the person he had built over so many years. He understood the body would change. That was inevitable. But discipline wouldn't. Discipline doesn't depend on age. It doesn't decline with time unless you allow it. And so he held on to it, not as a habit but as an anchor. Every time he stepped into the gym, every time he repeated familiar movements, he wasn't just training his body. He was reminding himself that he was still here, still in control of some part of his life. Training was no longer about fame, not to prepare for a role, not to maintain an image. It became part of existence, a way to keep things from slipping away too fast, a way to resist the feeling that time was taking pieces of him. And in the process, he realized the goal was no longer to get stronger like before, but to hold on to what mattered most. Holding on to identity. That was what he fought to protect. Not titles, not recognition, but the person he had become through all those years. A disciplined person. A person who doesn't give up. A person who doesn't let circumstances define him. And even if the body changed, even if the speed decreased, he didn't allow those things to take away his core. If he stopped, he would lose himself. That statement wasn't exaggeration. It was a truth he understood very clearly. Stopping wasn't just resting. For him, stopping meant losing structure, losing an anchor, losing what had helped him overcome the past and exist in the present. And so he didn't stop. Not because he wasn't tired, but because he knew the cost of stopping was even greater. There were harder days than others. There were training sessions where the body didn't respond as he wanted. There were moments when he realized he wasn't like before, but instead of seeing that as failure, he learned to accept it as part of the journey. Not an ending, but another phase. Another battle with different rules. And in that battle, victory was no longer measured by absolute strength, but by persistence. By continuing to show up, day after day, no matter how hard. By not giving up what had shaped him. Michael Jai White might no longer be the fastest or strongest like before, but he was still the one who doesn't quit. And in a world where everything changes, perhaps that is the most enduring form of strength. Time can take speed. It can take flexibility. But it can't take will, unless you allow it. And Michael, in his own way, is still fighting. Not to defeat time, but to not be erased by it. Not to keep everything as it was, but to hold on to what matters most, himself. As the years passed, Michael Jai White's image in the eyes of the world seemed to change very little. He remained the man with a solid physique, calm gaze, and near absolute control in every movement. On screen, he still embodied strength. The man not easily defeated, the one who always stood firm against any opponent. In real life, he still maintained his discipline, still appeared with the composure many admired. From the outside, it was the image of a man who had mastered his life, someone not easily shaken by any event. But that very steadfastness hid another reality. A reality not everyone could see. Beneath that control was a quiet space where thoughts never truly stopped. Where memories still existed, not loud, but always present. A person can control the body, control actions, but not always control what happens inside the mind. And in that silence, there was a kind of loneliness not everyone understood. He wasn't someone who shared easily, not because he had nothing to say, but because he was used to keeping everything inside. From childhood, he had learned that showing too much could make him vulnerable. That control wasn't just about the body, but also about emotions. And over time, that became instinct. When pain appeared, he didn't talk much about it. When questions returned, he didn't seek to explain them to others. He carried them, the way he had carried everything else in his life. There were people around him. There was family. There were relationships. But the presence of others didn't always mean being understood. There were emotions that, even when you tried to express them, others could hardly fully feel. And so he chose the simpler way, keeping them to himself, not because he wanted to be isolated, but because he didn't know any other way. The paradox began there. Strength, the thing that had helped him survive, helped him overcome the past, helped him build who he was also the very thing that made him isolated. When you're always strong, others rarely think you need help. When you're always in control, others believe you have nothing to share. And over time, that image became a distance not created intentionally by anyone, but still there. Strength made him respected, but not understood. He was respected for what he showed, for his discipline, for his steadfastness, for his ability to stand firm against everything, but that respect didn't equate to understanding. People saw the result, but not the process, saw the strength, but not what it had to carry. And so he existed in a space where he was acknowledged, but not fully understood. That wasn't always obvious. There were days he felt okay. There were moments when everything seemed balanced. But there were also times in the quiet when that feeling returned, not like a big wave, but like a silent current, reminding him that there were parts of himself no one else could reach. He didn't try to change it radically, not because he didn't want to, but because he understood it was part of who he was. The strength he had built wasn't a shell that could be easily removed. It was the result of many years, of experiences, of choices. And along with it, the loneliness also became a companion. But if looked at another way, it wasn't entirely negative. That loneliness didn't stop him. It didn't make him lose direction. It was just part of the journey. A part he learned to accept, like he had accepted many other things in his life. Not to change everything completely, but to understand that not everything needed to be resolved. Michael Jai White wasn't lonely in the traditional sense. He wasn't cut off from the world. He didn't lack relationships. But there was a part of him that only he understood, a part shaped by everything he had been through, from childhood, career, loss, to the way he learned to keep living. And that part, in its natural way, always existed in its own space. And perhaps that was the price of strength. Not visible pain, but a hard-to-name separation. A man who could stand firm against everything, but not always have someone stand with him in his inner space. And in that stillness, he still continued, not because he didn't feel lonely, but because he had learned to exist with it. And after all, the years of fighting, the times overlooked, the doors only half opened, the losses that couldn't be named, Michael Jai White's story didn't end the way many expected. There was no perfect ending, no moment when everything was fully mended, no straight line from suffering to peace. His life wasn't the story of someone who won everything. It was the story of someone who went through everything and still kept walking. He wasn't perfect, never had been, not the biggest star in Hollywood, not the one with the most brilliant career, not the flawless role model people often build to talk about success. There were dreams that didn't come true. There were opportunities that never returned. There were questions that never got answers. And there were wounds that never fully healed. But it was precisely in all of that that his real self was formed, not through what he achieved, but through what he endured. He didn't win in the usual sense, not the kind of victory the world usually celebrates, titles, spotlight, absolute recognition. Instead, he won in another way, a quieter way, harder to notice. He didn't fall. When everything collapsed, he didn't disappear. When the pain lingered, he didn't give up. When the world didn't see him, he still continued to exist on his own path. And sometimes that is the hardest form of victory. Michael Jai White didn't become an icon because he never failed. He became an icon because he didn't let failure define him. He survived things no one prepared him for. He endured things no one could fully share. And he continued, not because he wasn't tired, but because he didn't know any other way than to keep going. His legacy isn't in the roles, even though they mattered. It isn't in the martial arts skills, even though they were impressive. That legacy lies in things fewer people see. Discipline. What kept him standing when everything around changed? Strength. Not just physical, but the ability not to be broken by circumstances. And endurance. The ability to continue even when there was no clear reason to do so. Those aren't things easy to turn into stories. But they are real. There's a belief many hold that time heals everything. That pain will eventually pass, that if you're strong enough, you'll get over it. But Michael Jai White's life didn't fully fit that story. Some wounds don't disappear. Some memories don't fade. Some losses never become okay. And that didn't make him weaker. It only made his story more real. Not everyone gets healed. Not everyone gets a complete ending. And not every journey leads to full peace. But that doesn't mean the journey has no value. On the contrary, it's precisely in those imperfect stories that we see another kind of strength. Not the strength to change the past, but the strength to live with it. Michael Jai White wasn't the man who fixed everything that broke. He was the man who learned to carry those broken pieces without letting them stop him from walking forward. And perhaps that's what his story leaves behind. Not a promise that everything will be okay, but the truth that you can still continue. Even when things never go back to the way they were. Some men don't heal, they just learn how to carry the pain. And in that quietness, in every unnoticed step, an imperfect man left a legacy not through victory, but through endurance. The story of Michael Jai White is not just the journey of an actor or a martial artist, but a haunting record of the price of perseverance in an unfair world. From his childhood in Brooklyn and Bridgeport, where he had to learn vigilance before learning how to live, to entering martial arts not out of passion, but for survival, we see clearly a person forced to grow up too soon. When he became a teacher, living a stable but empty life, that wasn't failure. It was a sign of someone who had never truly had the chance to choose his own path. Even when Hollywood opened with Spawn, that door never fully opened, reflecting a familiar reality in America. Talent isn't always given fair opportunity, especially for people of color in the entertainment industry. The peak of tragedy was the loss of his son, the moment when all his strength, discipline, and control became meaningless. Exactly as in the motif, he could fight the world, but not fate. What hurts viewers most isn't that he fell, but that he was never truly healed, only continued living in silence, carrying the guilt of what if and endless sleepless nights. But that's precisely what makes his quiet greatness. He still trains, still holds discipline, still rebuilds his life with Gillian White, even knowing that success felt smaller after loss. For Americans, a place that highly values success and victory, this story is a profound reminder that not everyone gets a complete ending. And true strength isn't in winning everything, but in the ability to keep walking even when wounds inside never fully heal. If the story of Michael Jai White makes you understand that there are people who are never truly healed, but still choose to keep going, please hit subscribe so we can continue telling journeys like this together. Thank you for listening. and see you in the next video, where we keep exploring those imperfect but deeply powerful human stories.